please tell me, who is Richard Archbold?
Well, kia ora, ko Richard Archbold e hau, ko Arch tokongoe ka rangaranga. So I'm Richard Archbold, but usually known as Arch. And I'm a principal and architect at JWA Architects in High Street in the Auckland CBD.
Beautiful. What is creativity, Arch?
What is creativity? So this is a huge topic and we could talk the whole time just on that. I think you'd obviously get very different answers from different people. So I guess one thing is creativity is quite personal. I think creativity is innate, though. I think it's a really deeply human instinct, and I think it's in all of us. I was watching a video recently and saw that archaeologists had found in Java a little seashell that was dated to 500,000 years old, and it had this little interesting pattern of etching in it that really suggested ornamentation or design or creativity. So I think that urge to make and see pattern and sort of express the world in whatever form it is, I think is really, really deep and ancient. And architecture is a really common outlet for expressing that, that creativity. I also think that creativity is a process and it involves practice and repetition. I think that's something that's baked into the way we teach and practice architecture. But it's a muscle that you need to exercise and you need to stay limber. You need to stress it and stretch it to kind of keep it productive. In architecture, creativity has got a lot of different forms, and it can be very slow. Making a building can be a very, very slow process. So that cycle, that creative cycle of repetition can be very long, from having an idea to developing it, solving the brief if it's a building, documenting it, getting it built. It can take years and years and years. So for me, that's why I'm really interested in other creative pursuits where I can go through that cycle much more quickly. So, I make music, I'm on the podcast, I do those sorts of things which we can do in days or weeks instead of years or even a decade. So for me, I think probably one of the linchpins of the whole process is that it is a cycle. And I love coming off the back of something I've made, whether it's a piece of music or a set of documentation, and then going back to the beginning and folding back in what I've learned and gained from the last one, so that you're always sort of improving. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's definitely sounds like an iterative process that takes place through the course of time, but also in the case of architecture, as is with music, with multiple people, and with teams and with influences and constraints.
Absolutely, yeah. I always say you should be suspicious of architects who use I too much, because it is a we practice. Even if it's just you, the builder is one of your collaborators, the structural engineer is a collaborator. On larger projects, your team, your architectural team, of course, are collaborators, and that might be 2 or 3 people, it might be 20 people. So it's fundamentally, architectural creativity, I think, is very much a group pursuit.
Well, one of the forums through which you've explored creativity in architecture has been your podcast, 76 Small Rooms.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Mm-hmm, yep. Absolutely. Where can we find that? SoundCloud?
You can find it on all your favourite podcast apps. Yep.
It's been run for the past 9 years now. Can you explore the story behind that with me? So it's between you, Natasha, Jeremy and Matt.
Yep.
How did you come together, and what's the reasoning for bringing about a podcast in a time when they weren't as common and they weren't as popular?
Yeah, it's 10 years this year, Yash. So we're actually going to be, marking that occasion, doing something special to sort of recognise that. And I can't believe, we've had 40,000 streams. We had no idea, that it would be, that anyone would listen to it. But it came about, we were really talking about the lack of there being an accessible, relatively jargon-free platform for discussion about architecture and related issues in New Zealand. I think it was a comment on Twitter came up about it. I think it might have been Courtney Johnston, who's head at Te Papa now, might have mentioned it or provoked it. And we were all friends. And it really just came together sort of in a flash. Within a few weeks, before we knew it, we were at Rich Naish's E-Type house over in Grey Lynn, which is now a finalist for House of the Decade. And it was winner of Home of the Year that year, standing there with a really bad digital recorder, waving it around in an echoey room. And we went from there. I think we're up to something like 60 episodes now, and have met an incredible bunch of people, explored a really wide range of topics, met a lot of our heroes, and had a huge amount of fun doing it. I think we're all each other's greatest fans in the podcast, and it's a really fun experience. There's always a lot of laughs in between the interviews.
The conversation definitely flows very well between the four of you, and I'm sure that dynamic between the team is a lot more important than just the pure substance of what you're talking about. Rick Rubin, in his most recent book, exploring the circle of creativity and effectively living life in a creative manner, talks about how the people are a lot more important than exactly what it is that you're doing. Because if you have the people, you might take a mediocre problem and bring it up to mark, or just abandon it altogether and bring about something new. Yes, the last time we spoke, you also introduced Ed Catmull's book to me.
Creativity Inc.
Yes.
Yeah,
and
fantastic read.
that echoes the same ideas.
Yeah.
You had some beautiful thoughts around that book. Would you like to explore some of those with me?
That was recommended to me by a friend, Sasha Judd, who's a fantastic speaker and presenter, and been a real kind of a bit of an inspiration for me in how to communicate visually and verbally as well. And she put me onto that book, which I kind of gobbled up. I've always enjoyed looking for descriptions or stories of creativity outside architecture rather than just within, and I think that's what appealed about that book. There's a lot of technical stuff about how the sausage is made, the technical challenges you have to solve when you're making a Pixar movie, and all the data and lots of big impressive numbers like that. But in terms of a process of creativity, I think that was what was really, and how you imbue that into other people to unlock them. So that comment from the Rick Rubin book, which I'll have to get the title off and read, is also in, Jim Collins mentions it in Good to Great. He talks about a brilliant team can take a mediocre project and make it amazing, but an average team cannot do that with an amazing project, an amazing brief. So Ed Catmull talks quite a bit about how you instill that in the people. And I think he's also a very generous creator. He talks about the we. He doesn't suggest in the book that he is any sort of driving force. I think, and that's what I particularly enjoyed, that the way that you can light all these different fires of creativity under a big bunch of people, and you can get a much bigger inferno than you can under any one creative head. Yeah, you read it?
Yes.
So what was your take?
Partly audiobook, partly just the whole visual book itself. I know you personally are a fan of reading books through the physical.
Yeah, I am.
Copy. Yeah,
I am.
Yeah, it's definitely a book that pursues creativity as just a way of seeing the world and the way you experience every instance. So when the moment does come to being creative, all of those instances and experiences build up into the place where you manifest. So Rick Rubin himself is a music producer and does a few other adventures on the side, but he talked about producing an album with the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Yep.
And they had approached him to produce 2 albums before, but he was very hesitant to work on those because they just seemed like they weren't in the right place and state of mind. It seemed like the dynamic between the group members was a bit competitive, or there was some issues behind substance abuse, I believe, at the time.
Yeah. This was producing Blood Sugar Sex Magic in about 1990.
And then when the time came for their endeavours together, it just worked and clicked. And it's not just about the people, but it's also about the time.
And the vibe.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes, the vibe itself.
Yeah. And I think, there's probably an interesting contrast there where in that environment you might have the liberty to wait until the right things align. And there's a real talent in being able to perceive that things aren't aligned and make that call. And that's not always the case in architecture. When the project arrives, you've got to commit to making it happen around those constraints. I don't know of many architects who would say, look, the vibe's off.
Let's just come back in tomorrow.
Come back in a few years when everything feels a bit better. Yeah, but no, Rick Rubin's amazing. I think he produced Olivia Rodrigo's album, I think. So you're talking like, 35, 40 years across all these different genres. So the skill in being able to unlock whatever that particular musician is wanting to bring forward so successfully is really, really cool, really exciting.
Yeah, it's 3 generations of music that
Yeah,
come together.
basically, right?
Yeah. One thing that I find quite challenging in talking about things and topics as abstract as creativity or art is the risk of talking in circles and not really extracting something of substance. You've got a lot of experience in this space. How do you navigate that challenge?
Experience talking in circles and not getting to anything of substance.
No, the opposite.
Well, I mean, to come back to that, I think I've benefited from some really, really good role models in how to communicate design visually, verbally, strategically as well. So I've learned a lot from people with decades of experience and a lot of deep thought into the strategy of communication. And I've talked to you before about the benefit of rehearsal and preparation as a tool to make sure you get to the point. You know, I'm a real believer, having done a couple of quite big conference talks, which I was just, terrified of doing. And I remain terrified every time I present. If there's a skill in anything, it's just learning to kind of calm that and hide it away. But, doing that rehearsal, understanding what you're going to speak to, why, what's important, when the point gets introduced to the conversation. For me, rehearsal and practice is the way that I ensure I get out what I need to say in the right order, in the right time. The crit formats now are pretty tight, and they're very good practice about how to make sure you've got 15 minutes of material in 15 minutes. And, really common issue is having 30 minutes of material and 15 minutes to present. So rehearsal and practice helps you curate and edit that material down. What's the most important points? When do I make them and in what order? And how do you do that? How do you answer that? That's different for whatever it is you're presenting to, right? You might be very early in a project where things are very high level and you're holding ideas up. You might be at a very decisive point where what you're seeking is a decision, and a direction so that the project can regain momentum or move forward. You might even be in a dispute. And there's a strategy about what is the best way to kind of communicate there. And I think all of these things are creative. I mean, one of the things I think hopefully we'll kind of touch on through today is a very, very broad definition of creativity. It's not just a thing that happens at the front and then you make the project. Creativity and design, I think, is something that happens right up until you hand the keys of the building over. Every one of those actions has a creative component. If there's a choice, there's creativity.
The fact that you stressed preparation rings quite true, because the last time we spoke, I think much of the discussion was around that side of things. So you talked about how in a senior position, one of your responsibilities as an architect is not only manifesting the project and making sure that it as an environment works, but also the preparation on how to pitch that environment to a client and be convincing and suggest exactly what you're trying to achieve. Can you talk me through how you've done that in the past and how you've been able to instill that skill that you've developed over the years into someone else?
I'd broaden it beyond clients for a start. Like, I think every time you're speaking is an opportunity to present, as it were. So it might be with an engineer, it might be with a town planner, it might be with someone from the council, it might be one of your colleagues, it might be an internal learning session, do a lessons learned on a project. It might be some of those things that studios do internally where they're talking about a personal pursuit or a creative thing. So making opportunities to present and hone that presentation skill, I think, is really what I would talk about. Because, opportunities to get in front of a client when you're early on in your career can be rare. Sometimes you get them, but they can be rare because naturally people are putting their most experienced people onto significant projects. So trying to make as many opportunities for people to present. And then secondly, I think having that ability afterwards to go, hey, that was really good. I liked what happened here. Maybe here that went on a bit long. What did you think about that? And having an environment where you can talk and have feedback about how those different presentations go.
It almost sounds like a continual crit environment.
I think that's a really good term. I mean, that's what I would like to achieve. Achieving that's hard, takes time. You get into aspects of culture and psychological safety and all of those sorts of things that let you achieve those sorts of environments. But I like the term continual crit, because I think that's a really good capture of the type of culture that I've enjoyed being part of and would like to continue to be make and be part of.
Will you always go with your words from first year of university through to today?
How do you mean?
Have you always been able to express your thoughts in, let's say, in just the words that need to be there?
No, and I think I've still got 1,000,000 miles to go. I mean, look how long I took to answer that last question, right?
You explored it.
Yeah, you can always use fewer words, and I'm better at that with writing than I am, writing static. You've got a bit of time to come back to it.
Well, talk to me about the evolution of your personal presentation cycle. So first presentation at university or high school, all the way through to today, and what's that development been like? Has it been quite linear, or have there been significant jumps in development that you've been able to know?
No, I think there's been really significant jumps, and probably one of the most significant ones to talk about would be that famous transition from study to practice. So we certainly had role models, as I'm sure happens today, coming through university. There's a good, strong culture of going to see the 4th and 5th years present when we were in 1st, 2nd and 3rd year, and see how those people presented. There was a obsession with drawing, hand drawing. We were at the very tail end of what I think was a zenith of hardline draftsmanship, really, and hardline drawing. And that tended to keep a focus on that visual material, which I've mixed feelings about. You'll never be less constrained than you are when you're studying. So the ability to explore in that way is laudable, and it's a very important part of it. But there was very little guiding us on how to speak to our design solution. So what I didn't really have is probably two things. I didn't have the skills in how to talk about it and how to present, but I also didn't really understand my process of why I was doing things. And that's why those first couple of years are so important, trying to break down what you think design is, and build it up again personally from within. And by about 3rd year for me, I was getting a little more clearer to be able to answer the question of why did you do that? So probably a difference between art and design is that design is looking to meet a need or solve a problem. It doesn't have one right answer, but it has better or worse solutions. And learning how to tell the difference between a move that takes you closer to a solution or further away is kind of one of those first steps. Once I understood I've made this move to achieve this, then I could communicate that in a crit or a catch up with a tutor, and then you could have a discussion about, well, why do you think it's made it better? Have you thought about this? And then you could really kind of accelerate along. After that, and getting into practice, which I think is a really tough landing for most people, and still, from what I see from a lot of graduates over the years coming into firms, that was another big shift where you start to see how design is communicated to a paying customer, a paying client, who has needs that are very rarely as out there and aspirational and exploratory as the briefs you get in university. And so that was a time where you start to see real experts presenting and talking about design. I had fantastic mentors working in London who were presenting clients on highly commercially driven projects, and how to get high design quality into that and thread that line between, you're managing a budget, you're dealing with all the constraints, and you're elevating the human experience in design. So once I started to see some of these professionals with decades of experience, that was another big shift that started to shape how I presented and how I thought and talked about design. And then probably the last step is sort of getting into the position of doing more of that myself, which was terrifying. But, just going through the process, learning, getting feedback from sort of trusted mentors, the increasing ability to video our presentations. And I always tell students, video your crit, video every crit. You kind of go into a fugue state during a crit and you don't really know what's going on. It's very hard to process the feedback while you're in front of your peers and while you're talking about your design simultaneously. And a video is just a fantastic way to step back later and go, I never knew I did that thing with my hand, or I didn't know I paused for so long. And you can look at it a lot more neutrally. And so that becomes a thing now where most of our presentations that we do in any kind of public setting are videoed, and I like to go back and watch them, and it can be quite unbearable. But I think it's a really great process to watch yourself and then go, okay, I've got to watch that thing that I'm doing, and I really nailed that point, so let's remember what were the tools that led to that, and this went disastrously, so let's think about how not to do that.
I remember following this piece of advice from you, and the first video of my crits that I watched back, we had a group viewing with a few of my best mates, and we watched all of our crits, and I could recount the number of filler words that I used.
Yeah.
I think I went through a string of 4 within the course of 2 seconds. I think I went, what I think is, and then continued my speech, and that was so tricky to watch.
Yeah.
But it makes you conscious of it, and it might be very difficult to fix at the start, and you might start taking longer pauses in your conversation.
Yeah.
But it's probably worth the reward towards the end.
I think getting a bit, getting comfortable with discomfort and getting comfortable with silence. Yeah. There's sort of nothing wrong. You don't need long. You think you need long. You really only need a few seconds of pausing to kind of get your thinking in order, and that can be preferable to sort of
and you're not thinking whilst you're fumbling
and you're not
through.
Thinking when you're doing that. You're absolutely right. Yeah. So, but we so want to fill silence that we use those filler words. So, have you continued to watch your presentations and your friends? You've done the same.
Yeah, and I try to watch some of my friends' presentations as well. There's qualities about everyone's style that you can begin to appreciate.
Yep.
You know, certain elements they may not be the most polished, but that you can see that they're definitely leading somewhere.
Yep.
Perhaps the way someone uses their hand gestures, or the way someone introduces a project with a story, or the way they capture your attention through the middle of the project by their voice tonality.
Yep.
And to a lot of people it comes naturally, but different aspects of different speaking styles.
One thing I immediately think is, I wonder if it really comes naturally.
Okay.
One of the things about looking like something comes naturally is if you actually prod into it and delve into it, those people often say, oh no, it's not natural at all, it's taken.
That's something I picked up from my uncle.
I picked it up, or, you know, I'm having a panic attack while I'm doing that, it just looks natural, all of those sorts of things. And I think that's a good level to get into. How it looks is very important in what we're talking about, and that's how many people will receive it. But in terms of how to, I think, learn and grow as a presenter, I'm always really fascinated and going, you know, what was it like when that question came through? You seemed unprepared. How did you process that? Or what is it feeling like inside when you do that? I'm quite interested in the psychology of those things. I think they can be applied personally to whatever your own hurdles are to successful presentation, and just continually get better. Yeah.
Well, a lot of the times when you're in a high stress situation, which for students can be a crit situation, where it's been 6 months.
Sometimes sitting down with a tutor is a high stress situation for some students. I mean, I've done huge amounts of tutoring over the years, and even just sitting down with the tutor, you can see that some students are kind of quivering.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and you sort of fall into a prey mindset in a way, just sort of in the back of your brain, and you're kind of fumbling a little bit through no fault of your own, of course. And the trick is, how do you either divert or use that state to then reach a mode of verbal fluency, or at least clear thinking, not necessarily verbal fluency, just being able to communicate your questions. You might not know everything, but just what are the right questions to be asking?
Well, one of the things you mentioned before was style, and I think that's a really good thing to kind of unpack a bit further, because there are real differences, and I think a lot of that style, you know, it's such an overused word, but authenticity of presentation is what starts to release what that style is. And I think it's a great observation that you see different styles in your classmates and other people, and you can start to delve into what they are. That's why I think that talk beneath is really interesting, because your own beneath is where that style originates from. You know, are you a formal presenter? Are you relaxed? Are you engaged? Are you distant? You know, and then to come to that point about, say, that situation of how to diffuse or communicate your ideas, trying to get in touch with whatever your fluency is. And I think that was something that took a long time for me to work out. I ended up, I was much stronger in drawing and modelling than I was in speaking. And so I used those things, particularly modelling, physical modelling. I started to lean more and more towards that as how I would communicate my work, because I was struggling to explain verbally. Drawing was good, but not in the interactive mode of sitting with a tutor, but a model that you can pull apart and you can sort of talk about and you can hold up. For me, that explained those kind of ideas. So whether it's in university or in practice, I'm a real believer in people having access to and being able to use whatever tool they're fluent in. So, I've been in places where there's a sort of software fundamentalism, that everything must be done in a certain way, and I've been in places where it's much freer. Like if this is your preferred platform, use that, because that will give us the clearest explanation and illustration of your design thinking. And we can work out later how to get it into Revit or whatever, So you can really see that when someone gets unleashed on a tool that they're fluent in, just the gap between what they're imagining and what you can see just gets so much smaller.
That bridge to be crossed.
Yeah, that's right. And that's in the simplest sense, that's what the crit is. It's trying to narrow the gap between what, as a student, you're envisaging and imagining and explaining, and what the critics and the rest of the class are perceiving. And it's the same in any presentation. If there's a gap, a perception gap, and you don't think that what you've visualised is being communicated clearly, it's very, very hard to bridge. And that's why.
And that gets so frustrating so quick as well.
Yeah.
You finish semester not feeling satisfied that you were able to communicate everything that was in there.
Yeah.
Everything that you
So a lot of the time, a satisfying student project is just the feeling that you communicated what you were thinking. And those first few years, you're knitting with boxing gloves on. There's such a gap between, I found such a gap between, well, I imagine this and I can see all of this, but I can't describe it or communicate it. And it's exactly the same when you're pitching for a new opportunity, say competitively. Your ability to convince someone of your vision of something that doesn't exist, that's really what it's about. And that's what we do as architects. We convince people to take a punt on something that doesn't exist, our vision of something that doesn't exist. And that's why, through the podcast as well, you see this, often the best architects are the best communicators, not necessarily what we would call the best designers.
I find it very interesting that when you look at drawings, they are also described as a kind of language, a design language or a drawing language. You're fluent in communicating visually. Yeah. And I think a lot of those lessons that you echoed can be transferred towards a visual style of communication as well. That oftentimes you can imagine something in your head and you might not have perfected the craft of being able to sketch it out. Mm-hmm. So you just aren't able to get your ideas out. You might be able to talk about it, and here we're talking about the other spectrum of people who might be good at visual communication but might not have developed their visual craft. You might be able to think about it and talk about it, but when it comes to showing it on paper, that's just a skill that needs to be developed and needs to be worked on. And another really interesting thing that I noted when you were talking about, it's not usually natural, but it quite often is deliberate for the strong points that people have in their communication style. I think for a lot of us, the things that we're proud of when we're older are the things that we were insecure about when we were much younger. So when you were at school, if you weren't able to, make friends, you would study the way people interact and study their conversations and what color shoes do people wear. If you weren't able to, succeed academically, you might put more of your efforts into that realm and become a fluent, very thoughtful and deep person. I think a lot of those qualities that you espouse and that you become proud of later are developed and are around because you know that there was a lack of it when you were younger, and you begin to develop a deep appreciation for it. And that's definitely what I see in myself. Does that ring true to you?
I think what you've described, the idea that how to be a confident person or how to be a popular person or how to make friends and seeing it as a problem to solve, I think that's quite a neurodivergent thing. And that's something that I can very, very strongly relate to. That a thing like that is a problem to be solved and wondering how other people do it without necessarily having an innate comfort or ability. So I relate very, very strongly to some of those examples. that you've given. And I can definitely relate to them coming through university, especially in those first few years with so much insecurity. Primarily not knowing what I was doing at all in the first year. It was bewildering, which is the point. But then feeling the confidence grow as I got some fluency in some modes. And then you get some reinforcement from your peers. I think that's really important. Personally, I'm quite validation driven. I need a dial on the dashboard that's giving me some feedback, and I respond quite strongly to that. So, you have your squad when you're at uni, and I have my squad today, and when you're getting gassed up about something good you've done or you're getting some feedback, it also lays the safe ground for you to get some constructive feedback about something that's not good. And they actually don't exist without one another. They're both essential. So that was something that kind of grew and grew and grew into that comfort of being able to be a bit more creatively brave at uni. And yet I still look back, and if I had one thing I'd say to myself, if I were doing it again, would be to be braver and divert from the rules and loosen and relax and almost not care. And I just mean not care by not care about what other people think. And that's extremely hard in a grade-based system where, in spite of all those things I've just said, someone still slaps a grade down in front of you and you're like, oh, that's not what I was expecting. So it's really hard to navigate that. But if I was going back and doing it again, I'd be telling my younger self, and I try to tell students this now, be brave, like go further. You'll never be less restrained than now. Design will only be more challenging and have to have more factors considered later. So really cut loose here. This is the least constrained you can be as a creator in the context of practicing architecture. And again, I get that looseness much more easily in some of my other creative pursuits, where you don't have a client, you don't have a budget, you don't have a program, you don't have building compliance. You can really just loosen out creatively.
I've seen a lot of times, at least personally, it's a lot easier to break the rules once I know them. And I think mastering the way that works, it works because, it's popular because it works for a reason. You do drawings in a certain style, or you might communicate a project in a certain way, so an introduction, body work and explanation, and then a conclusion. It works, that's why it's around. And the creativity sort of comes when you practice that process so deeply with others, gain their input, and then you start to notice patterns and start to notice tweaks where you might divert and what rings true to the project in that circumstance. After reading your book recommendation, Creativity Inc., Ed Catmull says, don't wait for things to be perfect before you share them with others. Show early and show often. It'll be pretty when we get there, but it won't be pretty along the way.
Yeah. I think that's great. I think Rowan Simpson, he was one of the early people in Trade Me. He's a very creative person. He's just released a book called How to Be Wrong. I think it was him who said this, but this concept of when you hand something over for feedback, you might go, look, this is 30% done, so I need 30% feedback. And that idea that you can get feedback at any stage. You just need to explain, we're this far along, so don't give me feedback like we're this far along, and then kind of folding that in. And it's great advice. Don't wait for it to be perfect. And anyone out there who's studying architecture who goes to meet the tutor in week 1 and then doesn't appear again until the final crit needs to heed that advice. I think you talked about learning, you talked about kind of knowing the rules and then breaking them. It just sort of reminds me to come back to fluency of, we like to see new and inventive things. That's what draws me to the creative arts that I'm most excited about, are where I hear and see and feel new things that I wasn't expecting. And then that in turn encourages me to then chase down and understand how it's been made. So Perry Culper is a professor. I think he's at University of Michigan. I met him at a conference and then discovered his work from there. And he does these outrageous hand drawings that are kind of full of all of the workings. And they're I wouldn't even call them abstract because they are descriptive, but they're just beautiful and flowing and intricate. And I'd never seen anyone draw that way, and it kind of sent me down a little path of exploration that I wouldn't have gone on my own. Like another one was like, there's a song on the new Charlie, on Brat called Von Dutch by Charlie XCX, and I'm just obsessed with how it's made, because the sound underneath it, and then I've watched all these YouTube videos that break down and get into a digital audio workspace and kind of explain how the sounds are made, and I find all that really inspiring. You hear or see something, I then want to explore it, so I might sketch it, or I might get out my guitar and work it out. That idea of imitation as a path to creativity, it's always struck me as a bit weird. No one learns an instrument by being just given an instrument and go, welcome to first year, now produce something, if you've never played it before. We imitate great works and we learn them, we learn those rules, and then we start to create. And yet architecture does that. Here you go, stand up after 8 weeks of study and present your scheme and all of its underlying logic to a group of strangers, and then get told why it's good and bad. It's a very interesting contrast to me. So that mode of education used to be more sort of Beaux-Arts, 19th century, where there would be a really strong underpinning of drawing and replicating plans and sections of buildings and building up a vocabulary. And that's just a shift in the kind of educational mode, but kind of fascinates me. And to kind of close the loop, I really believe in curiosity. You see something, it inspires you, and then you try to understand it so that you can synthesize it into whatever your design thinking is, or music writing is, or presenting. You understand it, and then you've got something you can take back and go, I know that device, I can now add that device to my toolkit. Does that make sense?
Yeah. You're swimming downstream instead of trying to fight your way upstream. In that sense, you're pulling on a thread of something that rings true at a deeper level, and then finding what's unique about that to you. And I guess being brave enough to believe that you will get there, and that whatever's unique about it to you will have value when it does manifest.
Maybe. I'm a real believer in there is the aspect of making and how things are made, I think, is very, again, that distinction between art and design. So, a song is designed, a drawing is designed. So that idea of, for me, understanding the underlying logic, for me, there's an incredible beauty in that. Seeing how a plan has been resolved and tightened, or understanding how the forces of gravity and wind are dealt with, or crowd movements, or a lot of those hidden things. But for me, understanding how those things are achieved are really, really useful for me to apply to solving other problems.
Could you then say that art is only when design is experienced? Because you might say that visual arts as well are a design of sorts. The painter strokes
undoubtedly
the canvas in a certain way, using a certain brush, certain combinations of colours. What you said earlier rang really true. I think with a lot of beginners in the architecture space, me being one, I feel a certain pull towards trying to do something completely original and something completely unique, but that just seems so incredibly difficult, and maybe that's not the right way to go about things. Maybe, what are your thoughts on that? This is still a space that I'm quite confused about, personally. Starting off with precedents or other examples, or maybe something from another industry, but you also want the work that you put in to be unique and useful, and not just a copy of the original, but grayscale. Yeah.
That striving for originality, I think it's baked into us. I think there's a prejudice against imitation. If we feel that our design or anything is imitative, it's pushing up against plagiarism, almost.
It feels cheap in a way.
Well,
Just pure imitation.
Pure imitation, but imitation's a gradient. And originality is also a gradient, I think. I'm increasingly of the view that there is nothing original, unless you were born in a bubble, off planet. I think everything we do is imbued with all of these experiences and things. It all comes from somewhere. As you study, particularly as you study history and theory at architecture school, and one of the purposes of those courses, I think, is to shine a light on a lineage, this movement to this person, to that movement, to this political context, to the need for shelter, to the need to scrape a pattern onto a shell, and see that lineage. And I think just being kind of relaxed about the fact that, the originality comes out of your authentic responses to design. I think if you race towards it, it'll shuffle out of view. It's quite hard to explain. I think the quest to be original can be a problem, as opposed to just being more in touch with what is your design expression and what is your solution. And I just don't know if there's anything original anymore. There's very, very few examples of people who I think are truly on the outside. Like I think of, to use another musical analogy, I think Aphex Twin. I don't know if you listen to Aphex Twin, but he'd be one of the few people who is very hard to put in a family tree of music and could be argued as being very original. But even from him, you can draw lines to where his inspiration are coming from.
His personal experiences.
Yeah.
He might not be striving for something, but he might be striving against the grain in a certain way. Yeah,
and I think there's often an element of obsession, like there certainly is in Aphex Twin's music. It's deeply obsessive. And one definition of creativity, I can't remember who it was basically to simply do something so obsessive that no one else has ever tried it before, which I quite liked, which is kind of about depth rather than trying to get out onto some limb that no one's been to. It's taking something and then just running it all the way down to the centre of the earth.
First principles.
Yeah.
Who are some of your mentors through the years?
Architecturally?
Through any creative endeavour?
I suppose starting with architecture, I got my first real experience of what practicing architecture was like in a couple of studios in Auckland, Shepherd and Rout, which still practice today. David Shepherd took me under his wing over a couple of summers, and I got a fantastic experience while I was studying of being able to immediately kind of contrast learning and practicing. And he was very generous with his advice and his time. Roy Collado and John Collins at Collado Collins in London were also a really big influence on me. That was work at a city block type of scale, and it was a real level up from what I'd been doing here in New Zealand, as much of the work in London. And I had fantastic mentorship at Warren and Marnie as well when I returned back. John Coop, Andrew Barclay, Blair Johnston, his presenting and design thinking, and a huge stable of people actually there who I learned a huge amount from and with.
What about in the music space? That path of conversation is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't had a mentor in music, but I have close collaborators, and my bandmates I've played with since 2001. And I think what kind of characterises that is just that psychological safety. We really trust each other. We really know. We couldn't tell you what we're trying to achieve, but we know whether it's good or bad. And being able to noodle along with something, and the guys will be like, that's too much, like do less. And me being able to hear that and go, you're probably right. So there's a sort of aspect of trust, and I suppose that's the difference between, say, mentoring, where you'll be sort of receiving guidance and building on it, versus collaboration, which is what I think probably happens in the band. I don't know if I've really had a musical mentor. I've had lots of inspirations, but what I value most in that space is the collaboration, the creative collaboration, and trusting people to go, they'll ears will prick up and they'll go, that's good, do that, or that's rubbish, like do less. It's usually do less. I find creatively in whatever I'm doing, a lot comes out, and then there's an editing process to pull it back. So I often say that you're creative, like in the studio, you're creative. The success of your creative process is judged by how much is in the rubbish bin. Like, you need a lot of, for me, and I think for most people, it's only later in your careers that you can go quite directly to a design solution. Early on, for me, it's all about throughput. This idea, that idea, that idea. And as soon as you have something to compare, you can start to go, actually, that's more interesting than that. And then you do 10 permutations of that, and you can go, okay, those three. and then it's sort of, for me, it's a process of narrowing. I have a graph I use in a presentation about time and design certainty, and there's this idea that you sort of narrow down to the solution from broad to
Can you
narrow.
get less certain?
Well, yeah, you can, right? But I actually think the path just kind of goes around here and all of this. And
It's like a spiral design process.
yeah, you're forced into certainties. You do have to make things more and more resolved. But it's, it's not necessarily a linear journey.
You've got a feeling that you're getting closer, but
Yep.
you'll only know when you're there.
Yeah, and there's an intuition. Some things are intuitive, and then some things are empirical. You can measure certain things that you're getting closer to your target. And I think parametric design, automation, and AI are all things that will help us with those measurable and empirical metrics of design, of which there are plenty. It's not all artistically open, but some of those very early moves where inspiration distinguishes an ordinary building from a exemplary building. Those are much more about intuition, experience.
This is going to sound like a very bro-sciencey, crystal girl way of describing it, but I was talking to a friend of mine who's quite insightful, and we came up with just the feeling that when you're in the creative process with others, it's almost like tapping into a frequency, and it's got to be the right people to access that frequency. And once you're there, it's like you do everything that you can to maintain it. So that's when you're in the flow state. You know you're either culling back or adding more. I guess more often, more importantly, culling back.
So I think that idea of creative complementarity is really nice. That 1 + 1 = 3. So that I think it's, if you've found someone who you can create with that way, I'd really encourage you to lean into that, because those partnerships are incredibly powerful. This idea that, for argument's sake, let's just say it's two people, which it often is in practice or music or those sorts of things, that those two people's abilities and talents, that they don't overlap, they cover a surface area, and the size of that surface area is the power of their collaborative talent. If they just become like one another, you haven't increased that surface area at all. So that idea of the differences in those approaches complementing one another in order to bring about some other kind of third way of design thinking that wouldn't exist on its own, I really love those ideas. I'm deeply drawn to those ideas. The partnership of Miles Warren and Maurice Marnie, I think, has always been quite an inspiration to me, of two very different talents that complement one another so well.
Yeah. Can you describe how that plays about in a commercial firm, in your firm, for example?
Yeah, well, the JWA was founded by Jonathan Walker back in 2003, so 2003, 2004, so we're coming up on 21, so like a young adult. And he is he built that practice from the ground up to 12 people where we are today. And I think in terms of that complementarity, I'm very new in that role. I think I'm only 7 or 8 months in. So learning how to develop that relationship that you're talking about. What are the strengths and weaknesses of each of us? How do they complement? What is the overlap? The overlap is important. I think it's important that no matter how many of these people, you can still put a pencil through some sort of common values in the middle. So I think we're still learning. How to maybe dance without standing on each other's toes. He's got a lot of skills I don't possess and can't, and hopefully I'm bringing something similar to that. That's kind of broadening what we can do. I think that's probably the idea, is broadening what we can offer.
Yeah, I like the way you describe it as a dance.
Yeah,
both the partners in the dance usually have different roles.
Yeah, and the first few songs might not be great, as you get into your rhythm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You talked about the graph in your presentations, which is time across architectural certainty, creative certainty, and narrowing that down, and then you related it to measurable metrics that are becoming better and better with AI and developments in software. Can you explore that for me, please?
Well, I think a large part of that is probably more parametric than AI, and I think there's a lot of confusion about those terms. Like, parametric design can do that analytical work of moving towards which, testing a lot of solutions and using a set of criteria to decide better from worse. So it can test those and navigate them towards you. AI is different. It's, the goalposts are moving possibly further away from us faster than we are moving towards them, as I'm sure you're aware. It'd be having different impacts in practices all over the place. It's certainly used in the last 2 practices I've been in different ways. From the most obvious sort of large language models where it's used for proofreading, where it's used for reducing word count down for various reasons, to digesting documents and asking to summarise. So there's quite a bit of that I see happening. The other, of course, is the video and image based from text is another one which I'd love to hear from you, actually, how that's used in school, in university. I've certainly seen it really in the last couple of years start to appear in the crit context, and I think there's some really interesting discussions there about originality or your own creative process and how students are using those. AI is certainly extremely good now, has been for a while, at giving a very convincing imitation of an image of a building. But of course, there's no building underneath it. There's nothing underneath that is sort of resolved. Now, its ability to get to do that is, I'm a AI skeptic in that I'm wary, but I also believe it's just accelerating to a point that's very hard for people to predict how capable it will become at some of the things that we add value to. So probably, I guess my point there will be, I think there's a potential issue with it challenging the perception of the value that architects can add. One of the earliest uses of AI that I remember was using it to challenge parking tickets, I think in London, maybe. So it was pulling through precedent law, looking at the case and writing a challenge letter and having this unexpectedly high level of success. I think it was a long time ago. So I can't remember what my point was going to be there. So as it's becoming more and more accomplished at creating these imitations of architectural imagery, I think there's a real risk of it challenging the value that we provide. If AI can produce this, what do I need an architect for? So I think there's a really interesting conversation for the whole profession there about, well, what do we actually do that is human, that is distinct, that is irreplaceable? I don't have an answer to that, and I think you'll get people who say the whole profession can be automated, and then you'll get those who say that there's aspects that can never be replaced. Yeah.
And that seems like a very direct conflict with the conversation we were having earlier, which is a lot of the creativity is in the process of making. And if a lot of that process is snapped out, then there's got to be different ways. There's got to be new ways of using those as tools. At university, at the moment, the way we explore AI use is, and I think this is the right way to do it, I think it's quite a wise way, is there will be certain studios focused very intensely on AI.
Yep.
And exploring where they might go. And that gets back to sort of drilling that hole obsessively and seeing what the capabilities of, in this case, software are and how it can be used in a creative manner. And the rest of us, me personally, having not done one of those deeply explorative studios, I try to use it a bit more as a tool to produce and quickly illustrate ideas, at least from a visual and an image and a video side of things. But I think, talking to some professors at university, it definitely seems that AI probably won't have the ability to curate, which is where the human intuition and experience and what you have been able to develop over the last several decades comes through, which is it might be great at producing this whole bulk of content, but that idea of curating and knowing what is likely to be appropriate to which situation and having conversations with your clients and going, okay, you say you want this, but reading through the lines, it sounds like these are the values that are more important to you, so perhaps that's more suited. It's definitely a challenging topic to have a conversation about because we just don't know what its capabilities are yet.
I want to agree with you about those things remaining valuable, but I honestly don't know. I honestly don't know the speed at which its ability to imitate reality is improving is kind of wild. I can't remember who said it, but I always like the quote by someone that said the best use of AI is to do the boring stuff for creative people rather than the creative stuff for boring people. There are huge parts of the making of buildings that can be automated. Specification writing and all sorts of things like that I think are real sitters for that. I want to believe that there'll be some magical part of the process that humans can offer and desire and will continue to not replace. But I honestly wouldn't bet on it. I just don't know. The conversation on AI will be different when I leave this room than when I came in.
So do you see it being an extreme as well, where AI takes over most of the facets of the architectural profession?
Again, I wouldn't want to predict. I think almost all of these things are possible. We rely on commissions and clients, and I think too much of the conversation is architects thinking about how AI might affect architecture. I think we need to look through the other end of the telescope frequently, and I think this is another whole thing about the existence of clients, which is not something that's part of tertiary education, and another one of those things that can take a lot of getting used to as you get across. But there's other forces outside architects' heads driving what it might do to our profession as well.
You're right, this is a very difficult topic to have a conversation about. And I just think about I think it's so funny about the days, potentially 10 years from now, where you might have a client, but the client that you're speaking to isn't a human person, it's an AI making value engineered decisions, but also the person communicating from the architect's end isn't a human, it's an AI.
I think that's happening
to an
now.
AI.
I think that's happening now. So I had coffee with someone recently. They've got a ChatGPT Pro subscription, and with that comes a bunch of additional bots that you don't get on the free version. And one of those is it's called the Negotiator. And this person is using that tool to buy a car. And it's a text and email exchange, so it's suited to that. And he was telling me that he'll get some text from the dealer. He'll put that into the negotiator. The negotiator won't just go, look, this is how you respond. It'll be saying, it looks like the tactic being used here is this. So the best way to respond to that is maybe even just wait. Don't answer for a couple of days. And then if you don't hear, you should try this. And then it'll say, maybe use this. And it's going back and forth. And I kind of said to him, so have you found it useful? He said, I would never not use this. If I was in this sort of exchange, I would use it. And then the other question I had for him was, how do you know that the person on the other end isn't using it? And it's just these two AIs. I'm certain that's happening. Mm-hmm. Maybe not in that case, but as soon as one side's doing it, it's just throwing the dice until you have two of them at it.
Garbage across.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Let's bring it back to a more defined topic, something that you have experience in, which is project delivery.
Yep.
What are some of the key areas in project delivery that you wouldn't think of when you were a student or a young professional that sort of made themselves clear to you along the years?
Yeah, well, I think like I said before, that the role of the client is a tough thing to get used to. The client either doesn't exist in university generally, or it's a tutor, or you define it. You might decide who the client is, but either way, the interaction that occurs once you're in practice isn't a large part of university. I'm not arguing it should. There's a place for that looseness, and there's so much to explore in an architectural education that, to get any of it into 5 years involves leaving some things out. So the existence of clients, I think, is a really, really big one. And I think the other thing that only became more apparent later on, and it was Tony Van Raat, who headed up Unitec School of Architecture, who told me this. He always used to just say that the profession is very broad. There are lots of ways to be an architect, and a lot of the time you can feel if you're not in the top few designers in your class, there may not be a place for you in the profession. So I think that's a realisation. There's a huge breadth of ways to be an architect that become apparent once you move out. Bob Borson, the American architect, his recent podcast, I think it's episode 170, he talks about some of these things about the transition from study to practice, and they really kind of resonated with me. They were American lessons, but I think they were very applicable here. So yeah, the breadth, the amount of opportunity to be an architect that's outside the sort of design bias, which isn't inherent and probably the right thing at university, that only becomes apparent once you kind of get out.
Where do your personal strengths play?
What are my personal strengths? I don't know. That's a very awkward question to answer. I've been lucky to have roles where I can hopefully have some influence on other people. Like I think I've been involved in some really big projects that have taken a very long time to deliver or haven't been delivered at all. There's a non-zero risk of non-delivery on really big projects. You know, one of the things I'm loving about smaller practice is it's faster and there's a much higher hit rate to construction of projects. So as a result of that, you know, relatively few completed buildings, I kind of often say I've hopefully made more architects than I've made architecture. So working in a large practice gave me a lot of opportunity to work with people at all sorts of different stages of their career. And whether it's a strength, I know I enjoy that aspect. I enjoy putting time in to growing architects, sharing hopefully something I've learned, walking through those architecture processes with a little bit of experience that I have.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that there is a risk for, obviously a non-zero risk for projects to fall through and not go through to build completion. What are some of those areas where a project might get inefficient from an architect's point of view, and how do you tackle it?
Well, I guess there's to talk to the viability thing, I think just as a little bit of explanation. You know, these really large projects have a number of hurdles to overcome to get built. You know, cost, compliance, sometimes there's a political element, COVID lockdowns, you know, all sorts of things can get in the way. And I kind of think, you know, and that applies at all project scales. I just think it applies more in larger, more complex projects. So I really think every building is a miracle. You know, the fact that anything happens at all to me is a miracle, and I try and see it as a miracle every time and not take it for granted. In terms of inefficiency, well, I guess probably first of all it's a case of, well, what is defining inefficient? You know, what is inefficient? So sometimes, you know, has the project been set up properly? Is there enough time and is there enough fee to do the work? So sometimes those things are not correct and the project is never on the right foot, right?
And that's something you wouldn't think about as a student.
No, and you know, there's often competitive commercial forces at play there. You know, a lot of work is competed for against others, and you're very commonly put forward the fastest and the cheapest within whatever your parameters are to win. So sometimes inefficiency, or whatever you want to call a project going off its rails, sometimes that can be from very, very early stages, right? So assuming those things are done well, there's all sorts of steps along the way that a skilled architect has to kind of navigate carefully and keep their momentum up and keep the decisions up. Briefing is another really tough one. Again, I'd caveat that this varies wildly by project, but on some projects, you know, you might get a really, really comprehensive brief, but it may also be a correct brief. It may accurately capture what the project needs to seek. Other times, you know, you might want to challenge it, and you mentioned it before. You might actually go, look, reading between the lines, I think these things might be more important to you. Or you might throw in something completely unexpected. Some clients are looking for that journey and some aren't. Now, so there's some uncertainty in there. You know, you have to not just answer the questions, but you have to know how to ask the right ones. So there's a sort of, there's a slightly uncontrolled phase there about do we know the problem we're trying to solve? So briefing can be a really, really big part. And I could give examples at every kind of step along the way, but maybe to come back into, say, our practice as an example. Getting the team right is obviously critical. again, I read Good to Great recently, and one of the things Jim Collins talks about is like getting the right people on the bus. So the idea of getting the right people into your practice, but he also talks about getting everyone into the right seat on the bus. So it's not just, who do you have in your team, but have you got the right expertise on the right phase of the project and kind of fitting everyone into the right steps? Now, in a big practice, that can be very complex because not only do you have a lot of people to choose from, but you have a lot of roles to fill. And people are always growing, so whatever their skill is here, at the end of a 4-year project or a 7-year project, it's going to be somewhere different. So I really love the kind of moving parts in there. But the short answer is, where do projects get inefficient? They can get inefficient at every single stage of the entire process, and that's kind of one of the awesome challenges of navigating them successfully.
Do you have any examples on the briefing end of things? Because one thing that comes to mind quite famously in Auckland is the case of Britomart. I believe in 1987 there was a competition held for the future of what Britomart would look like, and one of the competition models was 3 high-rise towers. Very different from what it is today, and very different from what it was in the early 90s. I think I heard Pep describe it yesterday at the introduction to the design briefs as a place where you'd go to get drugs and alcohol. It
was the old bus station. It was a pretty grim area.
Yeah, and totally different from what it is today with Hotel Britomart. And I guess it's one of the more sought after places in the city. All of that was through the process of challenging briefs. What's an example from your end? It seems like the potential for that to manifest into a project. I want to frame my words right. To manifest a project to what it could be. Do you have any thoughts on that and real life examples?
Don't know about real life examples, and I think it'd be really the story of Britomart's a really fascinating one, and people, they've been there for a long time.
25 years, I think.
Yeah, it's a great story there. I think there's probably, again, I don't know the details of the briefing, but there's a subtle difference between an open-ended brief and challenging a brief. They're kind of quite different things. I'm quite interested in the latter because often strategically that can be a winning move, is to not just answer the brief but exceed the brief in some way. You might be offering, the most obvious way is you're offering some more services, but the most, I think one of the most interesting ways is to say, look, yes and, so here's your brief, but we've actually seen an opportunity for it to be this, this and this. So they're kind of slightly different. I don't know how the briefing process for Britomart worked. Yeah. I suspect it was kind of a quite expensive brief that invited lots of solutions. So maybe a local example is the Federal Tower down by Sky City. That was an open competition. And that, I think it's interesting to look at the different range of responses there for examples of how a brief generates different responses. And I think I've talked to you before about one of my favourite examples is there's a Park Avenue project in New York, and you can watch this online. There's a Guardian article called Pitch Battle, and linked in it are the presentations by the 4 architects who bid for that work, and I think it was Patrick Schumacher of Zaha Hadid, Richard Rogers, Norman Foster, and Rem Koolhaas. And it's probably a bit more about presentation than answering a brief, but each of them have responded to the brief differently, and each of them present really differently.
Was it Foster that took the bag?
Yeah. Yes. And he used A0 printout boards that he put through. Everyone else had a PowerPoint. I think you should all just watch it for yourself and form your view. But what was my takeaway? Norman won it with Lord Sir Norman won it with a different approach. So he had hard copy drawings. I think he sketched on some of them. That may have been a factor, but also for practices that, at least at university, we would hold up as being, exemplary. And there's some big names in there and some huge experience. I was amazed at the variability of the presentation quality in there. Once you sat down in front of a developer and need to not just talk about vision, but answer some basic questions about the building, I think that's a really interesting watch, and I think every student should kind of watch those 4 to see how internationally regarded architects talk about their work.
Can you talk a bit more about the difference between an open-ended brief and challenging the brief, and why it pulls you more towards the latter?
So I guess an open-ended brief or an expansive brief might be calling for proposals with some guidelines that you have to meet, but not being particularly prescriptive about, being less prescriptive about guiding towards an outcome. So some of them might simply be looking for, there'll be a site, there'll be a certain amount of area, there'll be flexibility around the requirements. At the other end of that scale is a super prescriptive brief, and you might even inherit a resource consent scheme or a bulk and location that might be locked in. But I think that's where the opportunity is to challenge. And by challenge, I mean you might go, you've told us this project is about this, but we actually think it's about this. And doing that in a way that's not failing to answer the original question, but yes and. It's answering that question and delivering something else. And I think that's one of the greatest things that we can do as architects, builders, and city makers, is always be looking to go beyond that. How much more can we offer, and how much more can we achieve within all the constraints? Of course I can do that if I can get another $50 million, but how can I do it still roughly within that brief? And I think that's exciting. I think I'm probably, to answer your last question, I find the former intimidating, the blank piece of paper stuff. I feel a bit more comfortable in reading between the lines and trying to perceive hidden opportunities in things and pulling on threads and going a bit further.
I like the way you describe your process as a yes and process, because typically that's a very useful way to learn more in a conversation as well. If you're talking to someone that you're really interested and you might not understand what's happening, a yes and usually teaches you a lot about what's going on, and it's the same process.
Yeah.
The same thing within a brief.
I got really obsessed watching The Bear, the TV show, and one of the things
Is this the one where it's not the cocaine bear, is it? Where
No,
he
it
hops
is
on
not
70 pounds of
Cocaine Bear, yes. There's a very different narrative. It's the chef in Chicago.
Right, that's
but
the one,
one of the
yes.
things Kami, the character, always says is say more. So there'll be a conversation and it stops for a second and he'll just say more. So it's that idea of can you kind of draw more out.
Yeah, pull more of the magic out. What are some of the areas over the next 5 years that you're really excited to explore? This could be personal, in terms of ideas, or on the podcast, or with your firm. What's looking like is bright in the future?
It's a great question, and I'm trying to think how best to articulate it. I am excited about, I think the change that's happened for me in the last year has been, I guess it's about being in more of a position to make, let me reword this. I think the change I've recently made was due to an opportunity to really make something, to really influence something at a scale I can get my arms around. And I think, I'm going to be 50 this year. It's taken me this long to feel confident enough to do one of those things. That's a personal thing. That's longer than I would have liked. But the gift of realising it is something I don't want to squander. I think there's an element personally of time too, like knowing that at this age I've still got gas in the tank to do something really meaningful, and not wanting to regret not doing something. Personally, it felt like a kind of brave thing, and I think others can judge if it was, but I think we thrive on doing things that feel like you're stepping off a cliff a little, and I've really enjoyed that. There's no growth without change, so it's felt like a real growing experience, changing direction, and I'm super, super, super excited about that. I think I'm probably ending the beginning of my career, is what I'd say, after having graduated, in 1998. I think the beginning of my career is coming to an end.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Arch. Let's wrap this up. Where can people find you and hear more about what you've got going on?
I am intermittently on Instagram. I am regularly haunting the crit halls of the uni here, Unitech and AUT. You can catch 76 More Rooms in your ears on all your favourite podcast apps. And I'm at JWA, and you can look me up online, and I'm sure you'll find your way to me. But thanks very much for having me, Ash. This has been fantastic. I hope it's of interest, and it's certainly been provocative thinking about some of the things that we've talked about today. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Arch. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.